I want you to picture a moment that probably isn't dramatic enough to talk about out loud. It's late. Not very late. Just late enough that your brain gets honest. You're scrolling. Maybe LinkedIn. Maybe Instagram. Maybe your bank app, even though you already know the number that's going to be there. And someone your age just bought a house. Or announced a promotion. Or casually mentions they're investing aggressively now. You don't feel jealous exactly. It's heavier than that. It feels like you missed something. Like there was a meeting about how life works, and you showed up 5 minutes late. You start doing the math in your head. You're 29. Or 34. Or 41. You tell yourself you should be further along by now. Not because anyone said it directly, but because everyone else seems to be moving in sync, while you're slightly out of step. What makes it worse is that, on paper, you're not doing terribly. You have a job. You pay your bills. You're responsible enough to worry about money, which already puts you ahead of where you used to be. And yet, the feeling sticks. Behind. Not broke. Not failing. Just behind. Behind some invisible schedule you can't quite see, but somehow feel judged by. I've felt this too. More than once. And what confused me most wasn't the money itself, it was how strong the emotion was compared to the reality. Because here's the strange part. That feeling doesn't go away when your income increases. It doesn't disappear when you start budgeting. It doesn't even vanish when you finally start investing. In some cases, it actually gets louder. And that's when I realized something uncomfortable. This feeling isn't really about money. It's about time. And comparison. And the quiet stories we tell ourselves about where we're supposed to be by now. Before we talk about numbers, or habits, or strategies, we need to slow down and look at that story. Because if you don't understand why you feel behind, no amount of financial progress will ever feel like enough. When most people say they feel behind financially, they don't mean a specific number. They're not usually saying, I should have exactly this much saved, or I should be earning this precise salary. It's vaguer than that. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Behind is a feeling without a ruler. We inherit it without realizing it. From conversations we have here. From headlines we don't fully read. From someone saying, by your age, I had already. And we internalize a timeline that was never actually written for us. Somewhere along the way, we absorb this quiet assumption that life moves in a straight line. School, job, promotion, stability, investing, freedom. Like stepping stones laid out evenly across a river. But real life doesn't move like that. It lurches. It pauses. It doubles back. Sometimes it stands completely still while everything inside you is changing. What we compare ourselves to isn't reality, it's a highlight reel edited by context we don't have. We compare our bank balance to someone else's milestone. Our messy middle to their clean outcome. And the brain is terrible at correcting for missing information. You don't see the help they had. You don't see the years they lived at home. You don't see the risk they took that could have easily gone the other way. You don't see the debt that doesn't get posted. But your brain fills in the blanks anyway. It assumes competence where there may have been luck. It assumes discipline where there may have been timing. And it assumes failure where there is actually just difference. Here's the part that quietly messes with people between 25 and 45. At this stage of life, financial paths start to diverge dramatically. Not because some people are smarter, but because earlier decisions compound. Sometimes invisibly. Two people earning similar salaries can feel worlds apart financially, depending on when certain things happen to them. Student loans. Health issues. Family responsibilities. A job loss at the wrong time. A job opportunity at the right time. None of these show up when you compare yourself to someone else. All you see is the outcome. And outcomes lie without context. So when you feel behind, what you're really reacting to isn't your finances. You're reacting to a distorted sense of timing. A belief that there is a now you were supposed to hit, and didn't. But here's the reframe that took me a long time to accept. There is no universal financial clock. There is no age where things are supposed to look a certain way. There is only momentum, starting, stopping, rebuilding, adjusting. And the danger isn't that you're behind. The danger is letting that feeling quietly rush your decisions. Because when people believe they're behind, they don't think clearly. They chase. They force. They try to compress time instead of respecting it. That's where bad financial decisions usually come from, not ignorance, but emotional urgency. Before we talk about money itself, we need to talk about what comparison does inside your head. Because once you see how it distorts perception, the pressure starts to loosen. Pause here. Does this reframing feel right to you? There's a moment I remember clearly. I was sitting at my desk, late afternoon light coming through the window, staring at a spreadsheet I'd opened for no real reason. I wasn't planning anything. I was just checking. Checking my savings. Checking my investments. Checking how far I'd come. And instead of relief, I felt this tightening in my chest. Nothing was wrong. But nothing felt right either. That's when it hit me. I wasn't measuring my progress against my past. I was measuring it against an imaginary version of someone else's present. Psychologists call this social comparison, but that phrase doesn't really capture how personal it feels. It's not a neutral comparison. It's emotional. Identity level. Your brain is wired to evaluate position. Not absolute position, but relative position. Thousands of years ago, that made sense. Being behind the group was dangerous. It meant less access to resources, less safety, less status. So when you see someone your age ahead, your nervous system reacts before your logic does. It feels like falling behind the herd, even when the herd doesn't exist anymore. Money amplifies this because it's one of the few areas where progress is visible and numerical. Salaries. Net worth. Home ownership. Titles. Numbers feel objective. But the meaning we attach to them is anything but. What's especially brutal about financial comparison is that timelines are invisible. You only see snapshots. You don't see that someone started investing during a bull market while you started during uncertainty. You don't see that someone locked in low housing costs years ago while you're entering a different economy entirely. You don't see the sequence, only the result. And sequence matters more than effort. Two people can do the same things with the same discipline and end up in very different places depending on when they started and what environment they were in. That's not comforting. But it's honest. Another psychological trap kicks in here, and it's subtle. We assume our current position says something permanent about us. About our intelligence. Our discipline. Our worth. Feeling behind quietly turns into feeling deficient. And once that happens, every financial decision becomes emotionally loaded. You don't just ask, is this a good choice? You ask, will this finally make me feel caught up? That's a dangerous question. Because it pushes people toward shortcuts. Toward risk they don't fully understand. Toward copying strategies that worked for someone else in a completely different phase of life. I've seen people invest aggressively not because it matched their risk tolerance, but because they felt embarrassed by starting late. I've seen people avoid investing entirely because starting small felt like admitting failure. I've seen people inflate their lifestyle because they thought looking successful would eventually turn into being successful. None of this comes from laziness. It comes from shame mixed with urgency. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. The more financially literate you become, the easier it is to feel behind. Because now you're aware of what compound growth can do. You're aware of missed years. You're aware of the math. Knowledge without self-compassion can actually increase anxiety. You start replaying alternate timelines in your head. If only I'd started earlier. If only I'd known then what I know now. But that version of you didn't exist yet. You weren't late. You were just early in becoming aware. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Understanding this doesn't fix anything immediately. But it changes the tone of the conversation you're having with yourself. And tone affects decisions. Before behavior changes, perception has to soften. That brings us to the moment where things begin to shift, not outwardly, but internally. The shift doesn't usually happen all at once. There's no dramatic wake-up call. No single spreadsheet or podcast episode that suddenly makes everything feel okay. For me, it happened in a very ordinary way. I noticed that the people I thought were ahead of me were still anxious. Sometimes more anxious than I was. They earned more. They owned more. They knew more. And yet, the feeling I recognized in myself, the restlessness, the sense of being late, was still there in them too. That's when a different question surfaced. What if behind isn't a phase you pass through? What if it's a story that keeps rewriting itself? Because the finish line keeps moving. When you're starting out, being ahead means having savings. Then it means investing. Then it means owning assets. Then it means optimizing taxes. Then it means passive income. Then it means freedom. At no point does your brain say, okay, we're done now. Comparison doesn't disappear with progress. It just upgrades its targets. And once I saw that, something loosened. The problem wasn't that I hadn't reached a certain level. The problem was that I was measuring myself against people in entirely different chapters, and assuming their chapter was the correct one. Financial timelines get distorted because we flatten them. We look at a 10 or 15-year journey and compress it into a single moment. We see someone's result without seeing their sequencing. But money doesn't move linearly. It moves in phases. There's usually a long phase where nothing looks impressive. Where effort goes in but visible progress is slow. Where learning outpaces earning. That phase feels like being behind, because nothing is externally validating yet. Then there's a tipping point. Not explosive. Just noticeable. Suddenly decisions compound. Income increases a little faster. Mistakes hurt less. Confidence becomes quieter, not louder. From the outside, it looks like momentum. From the inside, it feels like stability. And here's the realization that changed how I thought about my own timeline. Most people you think are ahead aren't ahead of you. They're ahead of a version of you that never existed. They started earlier. Or differently. Or with fewer interruptions. That doesn't make your path wrong. It makes it yours. When I stopped asking, why am I not there yet? And started asking, what phase am I actually in? My decisions changed. I became less reactive. Less tempted to rush. Less likely to copy someone else's strategy just because it looked further along. The urgency softened. And clarity crept in. This is the turning point most people miss. Not when their income jumps. Not when their net worth hits a milestone. But when they stop fighting time and start working with it. That's where healthier financial behavior begins. Not from pressure, but from alignment. Next, I want to talk about what changes naturally after this realization, not as rules or advice, but as quiet behavioral shifts I've seen over and over. What surprised me most wasn't some dramatic financial turnaround. It was how subtle the changes were once that constant sense of being behind eased up. Nothing external forced them. No strict rules. No sudden discipline upgrade. Things just adjusted. For example, I stopped trying to make my money prove something. Before, every financial decision carried emotional weight. Every investment needed to feel meaningful. Every move needed to feel like it was catching me up. That pressure made small decisions feel huge. And huge decisions feel urgent. Once that eased, money became quieter. I didn't feel the need to optimize everything at once. I became more comfortable starting imperfectly. I noticed this especially with investing. Instead of asking, is this the best possible move? I started asking, is this reasonable for where I am right now? That question changes everything. Because it removes comparison from the equation. When you're not trying to compress 10 years into one, you stop reaching for complexity too early. You don't feel embarrassed by simplicity. You don't feel late for starting small. I've seen this pattern repeat with people over and over. When the fear of being behind fades, people naturally slow down just enough to think clearly. They read more carefully. They ask better questions. They take risks that are sized for their actual life, not an imagined one. Another shift happens around spending. When you feel behind, spending often becomes emotional. Either you overspend to feel like you belong, or you restrict so hard that money feels like punishment. Neither creates peace. But once comparison quiets, spending becomes more intentional without effort. You're not trying to signal progress, to yourself or anyone else. You buy fewer things that impress. You keep more things that stabilize. Not because you're more disciplined, but because you're less distracted. Even budgeting changes tone. Instead of feeling like a correction for failure, it starts to feel like orientation. Like checking a map, not scolding yourself for getting lost. And maybe the most important shift is how you think about time. You stop asking, how fast can I fix this? And start asking, what can I sustain? That's a very different energy. Sustainable behavior compounds quietly. Urgent behavior burns out. The irony is that once people stop rushing to catch up, they often start moving forward more consistently. Not faster. Just steadier. This isn't about becoming passive or lowering standards. It's about removing the emotional noise that makes everything feel late. And when that noise fades, you don't need motivation. You just need direction. That leads into something deeper: how distorted timelines shape confidence itself, not just decisions. There's something subtle that happens when you believe you're behind for too long. You don't just lose confidence in your money. You lose confidence in your judgment. You start second-guessing decisions that are actually reasonable. You hesitate. Or you overcorrect. Both come from the same place. When timelines get distorted, progress stops feeling like progress. It feels like damage control. You might save money and still feel irresponsible. You might invest consistently and still feel late. You might improve your situation and feel no relief at all. Because your internal clock isn't synced to your reality. This is where comparison does its deepest damage. It doesn't make you reckless. It makes you unsure. You look at your choices through the lens of what should have already happened. And that lens is unforgiving. I've noticed this most clearly in conversations with people who are actually doing fine. They'll say things like, I know this is probably okay, but... Or, I feel like I should be doing more by now. That word, should, is doing a lot of emotional work. It's not based on a plan. It's based on a borrowed timeline. And borrowed timelines are impossible to satisfy. Because they weren't built around your constraints, your starts, your stops, your responsibilities, or your risk tolerance. They were built around someone else's sequence. Confidence doesn't come from hitting milestones. It comes from understanding your position in time. When you don't know what phase you're in, every outcome feels like a verdict. Every number feels like evidence for or against your worth. That's exhausting. And exhaustion leads to disengagement. This is why some people stop checking their accounts. Why they delay decisions they know they need to make. Why they avoid learning more, even though they're interested. Not because they don't care, but because caring hurts. Feeling behind turns financial curiosity into emotional labor. Once I noticed this in myself, I stopped trying to fix my confidence. I focused on correcting my timeline instead. I asked quieter questions. What has actually changed in the last year? What am I more capable of handling now than before? What decisions feel less scary than they used to? Those answers didn't come with fireworks. But they rebuilt trust, slowly. And trust is what confidence really is. Not certainty. Not optimism. Just the belief that you can respond to whatever comes next. That belief grows when timelines become realistic again. Which brings us to the final stretch, not a solution in the traditional sense, but a calmer way to relate to where you are. There's a strange relief that comes when you stop trying to outrun time. Not because you've given up, but because you've stopped arguing with reality. For a long time, I treated time like an opponent. Something to make up for. Something I had already lost ground to. Every year felt like a quiet countdown. But time doesn't respond to pressure. It only responds to participation. When you let go of the need to catch up, you start making decisions that assume you'll still be here later. That assumption alone changes everything. You stop reaching for outcomes that require perfection. You stop needing every move to work immediately. Instead, you make choices that are repeatable. And repeatable behavior is where financial growth actually lives. Not in bold decisions. Not in clever timing. But in showing up without drama. This is where people misunderstand patience. Patience isn't waiting. It's continuing without urgency. When you're no longer measuring yourself against someone else's timeline, consistency stops feeling slow. It starts feeling reliable. You invest even when it feels boring. You save even when it doesn't change your identity. You learn even when there's no immediate payoff. And slowly, almost invisibly, things shift. Not in a way that impresses others. In a way that stabilizes you. I've noticed that people who feel behind often underestimate how powerful neutral time is. Time without panic. Time without comparison. That kind of time compounds behavior, not just money. It builds familiarity with uncertainty. It builds trust in process. It builds resilience you can't rush. And the irony is that when you stop demanding proof that you're ahead, evidence starts appearing anyway. Not as milestones. As ease. Less emotional reaction to money. More clarity when making decisions. Fewer moments of self-doubt. Those are signs that your relationship with money is maturing, even if your numbers are still catching up. We're almost at the end now. All that's left is to sit with what this means, without trying to turn it into a formula. There's a result that almost never gets talked about when it comes to money. Not because it's rare. But because it's quiet. It doesn't look like success. It feels like steadiness. At some point, often without realizing when, you stop checking where you stand as often. Not because you don't care. But because your sense of worth is no longer tied to the number. You still plan. You still track. You still think about the future. But it no longer feels like a referendum on who you are. I remember noticing this change on an ordinary morning. No milestone. No breakthrough. I logged into my account, looked at the numbers, and closed the app. No spike of anxiety. No urge to compare. Just information. That's when I realized something important. Feeling ahead was never the goal. Feeling grounded was. Grounded enough to make decisions without panic. Grounded enough to tolerate uncertainty. Grounded enough to trust that progress doesn't announce itself loudly. Most people who seem confident with money aren't confident because they've won. They're confident because they've stopped fighting their own timeline. They've accepted that some years are about positioning, not payoff. Some phases are about learning how they react under pressure. Some stretches look flat but are quietly necessary. When you stop treating your financial life like a race, you stop turning every delay into a failure. You begin to see progress where it actually lives, in reduced fear, in clearer thinking, in calmer decisions. That's not the kind of progress people post about. But it's the kind that lasts. We'll end with one last reflection. Not advice. Just a thought to sit with. If you felt behind, there's a good chance it was never because you were doing something wrong. It was because you were measuring yourself against a story that didn't include your full context. Your timing. Your interruptions. Your learning curve. Money has a way of turning time into a judgment. Of making years feel wasted instead of formative. Of making slow progress feel like no progress at all. But most financial lives don't move in straight lines. They move in seasons. There are seasons where you build quietly. Seasons where you recover. Seasons where you finally see momentum. And none of those seasons announce themselves while you're in them. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Feeling behind is not a signal to rush. It's a signal to reorient. To check whether the timeline you're using actually belongs to you. To notice whether comparison has been doing more thinking than you have. You're not late to your life. You're not failing at money. You're not broken because progress feels slower than you expected. You're just in the middle of it. And the middle is always quieter, messier, and less impressive than the ending people like to show. Financial confidence doesn't arrive as a moment. It settles in as a tone. A little less fear. A little more clarity. A growing sense that you can handle whatever comes next, even if you can't predict it yet. That's not being ahead. That's being grounded. And for most people, that's the real work.